Hey guys, Metal Jesus here, and you are listening to Discography Discussion.
You're listening to Discography Discussion, episode 123, Alice in Chains, featuring Jason of MetalJesusRocks.
God, they just destroyed it. It's awesome.
Hosted by Dan Terry.
They just auditioned a whole bunch of really bad singers.
And Joe Wren. Jerry Cantrell can do whatever he wants. Presented by discussmetal.com. And if you think a custard pie is the only solution to your Yeti problem, then you are ready for this episode of Discography Discussion. I am Joe. That is Dan. Jason is here of MetalJesusRocks.
What up? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure for sure. It's funny, whenever I was a wee lad, and not really that wee, but whenever I started watching YouTube videos, I remember subscribing to your channel early on and then started watching. And originally I would skip the gaming videos just to get to the metal videos, so to speak, the ones where you'd be like, this is what I've been listening to, or this is what I've been into. But being a huge retro gaming fan myself, I eventually got into all the retro gaming videos as well, and it's been quite fun just watching a channel that you started off watching a few years ago get to where it's at now.
Yeah, thank you. And it's funny, lately I've been wanting to be on some more podcasts, and specifically some music-specific podcasts. And so my short list had yours at the top of it, and if you want to know the truth, I was actually too shy to ask you to be on it, because I was like, oh, I don't, they're not going to know who I am. Like,
oh, no, man. I mean, as far as that stuff goes, I mean, we're about as chill as it gets as far as that stuff.
Well, you did a couple episodes of my absolute favorite. So first of all, I got to do a huge shout out to your Dream Theater episode, which you had to do twice.
Yes.
But you did it, which was awesome. And then also the Opeth podcast episode, which was, again, fascinating to listen to. I love what you guys do. So I'm honored to be here today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we appreciate it big time. The Dream Theater one was one of our first technical hiccups where we we recorded half the episode, and I think like 3 weeks went by, and then Joe calls me and says, hey, dude, half the episode's gone. And I was like, what are you talking about?
Oh, man.
He's like, it's gone.
The first technical hurdle we ever really ran into was that episode, and all I can say is we did the whole thing, and somewhere along the line, about an hour into editing, everything was garbled. 5 tracks of audio, just you can't understand anything. It sounds like a robot. I kept it for my own amusement, but it wasn't listenable. So that was the first, okay, well, we have to do it again, but we also have to put something out this weekend. So it got done, and I'm happy with it.
Well, I'll share a little piece of where I can kind of relate, where I live in Seattle, and so there's a bunch of video game companies around here, and a really good friend of ours from the Sierra days was working at Valve. So Valve is in Seattle as well. They're actually in Bellevue, Washington, which is really close. And he was giving us a private behind-the-scenes tour of Valve. And I mean, it was basically just the 3 of us, or the 4 of us. Brought my camera along, and then when we got home, we realized that the microphone was off the entire time.
Oh, no.
There was no audio whatsoever. And it was such a kind of like under-the-radar sort of tour that we could never really redo it. So it happens.
Did you think about calling him and having him come to your house to overdub the entire video?
It was one of those moments where now every day, or every time I shoot a video, I'm always like looking at the red light going, both on the camera and also on the microphone going, okay, is it on? Double check. You know what I mean?
Also, I have a yes or no question for you.
Sure.
I can't even see that.
He is saying Portal 3. So here's the thing, I just got back from E3, and I fully expected to see at least something from Valve announced there, and I thought Portal 3 was going to probably be the most likely of things that they might announce, but they didn't. So I was really surprised.
I can dream.
So the thing about Valve is, and we can go on a tangent here, but Valve is a very unusual company in that it is completely flat as far as its structure goes, meaning that there are no managers, no bosses at all. Everyone is on the same level. And so the way that works at Valve is that you as an individual, if you were hired there and you want to make Portal 3 or Half-Life 3, you have to build your team and basically sell it to the rest of the company and get people to move over to that. Anyone can do it. It's a really interesting place to work, but it's also can get bogged down in not getting anything done. And that's what you're seeing. That's my feeling for that. So
one side of that, I remember there was a story a few years ago that someone had an issue and they sent an email to Gabe Newell thinking they were going to the top of the company. And his response in so many words was, "What's your ticket number?" Like, we're all available. We're all here to help you. Just send me your issue. We'll take care of it.
Yeah, it's a truly unusual company in that regard. And they've been that way ever since. And the reason I know is because a bunch of old Sierra folk that I used to work with moved when Sierra collapsed. They went over to Valve. So anyways, not to derail our podcast any, but I can nerd out on video game stuff too.
We'll keep that in mind.
We'll save that for the end when everybody's a couple of beers in, right?
Yeah.
That's usually how we roll. So this week we're going to talk about Alice in Chains. So whenever we had been doing the, no pun intended, email chain back and forth about what bands we want to talk to, Jason actually threw out a whole bunch of bands, and I was like, oh, wow, okay, cool. I want to talk about all those bands. I do. Some of them are going to take me a little bit more time to familiarize myself with. I mean, I've done some crazy ones like 14 albums in a week or 20 albums in a week, and full disclosure, sometimes I'll take longer than a week if I have to. But what's interesting is that with Alice in Chains, in my mind, I was like, what? Why didn't we already talk about Alice in Chains? Was the first thing I thought, because it's like 100 and something episodes now. It's hard to keep track. And I was like, I feel like we've had this conversation before. And I was like, no, we've never done an Alice in Chains discussion at all. And I couldn't understand why. So I was like, well, that's not going to be so bad. That's only a few albums and a bunch of EPs. And
then you remembered they had newer albums,
yes,
featuring a whole new lineup, mostly just a new lead singer. But if your guy sounds like Lane, it can't be a bad thing. Jerry Cantrell is still doing exactly what he does so well. I do think that man is a genius, but we will get into that.
Yeah, no, this was a good one for us. I know I think I recommended that we do Kiss because I'm such a huge Kiss fan, but they have 30 regular albums, and that's a lot to take unless you're actually familiar with it, right?
We've kind of teased at it, like if enough people demand it, so to speak, we'll do it. But it's one of those, like, just want to let you guys know I'm going to be taking on quite a bit of, I mean, everybody knows a few Kiss songs. You know, even people that are just casual radio listeners are going to know a few songs, but to dig in, and then I had to ask myself, are we going to just do the official Kiss albums, or are we going to do like the solo albums from each member, or like there's so many different offshoots there that it would have just been so overwhelming, and so I think it's going to happen. It may be the first episode we do in multiple parts.
I was going to say, I would think that would be my recommendation for Kiss, is do everything up to probably Creatures of the Night, or maybe, you know what, actually what you should do is you should do the 70s stuff up to Music from the Elder. So that's the album that everyone hates, and it basically caused them to reboot the band. And so you do that up to the Elder. That's episode 1. And then everything else beyond that. That could be another episode.
We could make the mistake of doing just the albums where they have makeup on and the albums that they don't have makeup. I have a feeling, based on most of the Kiss fans I know, the second episode would get ignored completely.
Well, maybe. Although, for me, again, we can go on massive tangents here. I don't know how tight you keep this because I could go on tangents. But I actually found Kiss in the 80s, right? So I'm an 80s kid. So I love the Asylum era, the Crazy Nights era, all that, the Lick It Up era too. I know I'm in the minority. But Alice in Chains is perfect because for me, like I said, I live in Seattle. In the 90s, I actually worked at a small record store in Renton, Washington called Budget Tapes and Discs. And, I was there going to shows when the whole grunge thing basically took off. So this will be cool.
Well, before we start talking about how much we want to be the minority, I want to take this time to say thank you to everyone for listening to the podcast. Thank you for listening and for subscribing. If you are not a subscriber, then you can find everything Discography Discussion at discussmetal.com. We are on Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio, Stitcher, so if you have an Amazon Echo or a Google Home, you have no excuse. Ask it to play the latest episode of the Discography Discussion podcast, and it will. We're also on Facebook and on Twitter at Discuss Metal. Be sure to like, favorite, and subscribe. It really helps us out. It lets us know you're listening. And now Dan is going to tell us all about 5-star reviews.
We love 5-star reviews here on Discography Discussion, and the reason we like them is because all of your recommended podcasts are controlled by an algorithm. And what that algorithm is always looking for is reviews. A highly reviewed podcast is going to get recommended to people that haven't heard it before. And that's really all we want. But like I said before, and as we've teased about even at the beginning of this episode, as soon as those 100 reviews are on my desk, we will do a Kiss episode, unless all 100 of those reviews say, don't do a Kiss episode. So if you guys want that, we will do it for you. If you don't want that, please let us know before we do it.
And now Jason is going to tell us all about MetalJesusRocks.
Yeah, so I am a full-time YouTuber, and I've been doing YouTube I started seriously back in 2010, and at the time I had an IT help desk job, and I was able to transition from that to doing YouTube full-time, and I forget what, like 2016 or something, 15? And so my YouTube channel is all about retro games and music and all things fun and cool like that. I put out 2 videos a week. And I used to, like I mentioned before, I used to work at a company called Sierra Online, which made a bunch of retro games. Well, they weren't retro at the time, but yeah, like adventure games. And there was a publisher, so they put out everything from sports games, racing games, adventure games, you name it, they put it out. So
lifelong King's Quest fan right here. 1 through insert the end, because they put out a new one a few years ago, and it was amazing. I'd also like to say on Dan's behalf, the jealousy in this room every time he sees your wall of big box PC games cannot be matched.
I do love my wall of big box PC games. It's a dream of mine to have that now. I have so many in there that either I didn't pick up at the time because I was an idiot, or I threw away at some point. So now I kind of feel like it's an archive of all those glorious big box PC games, and it's definitely one of my favorite parts of my collection.
So Dan, tell me about Alice in Chains.
Well, which one? See, the funny thing is there were actually 2 bands called Alice in Chains. One, it wasn't fronted by Lane Staley, but he played drums, I think, in the original incarnation of Alice in Chains, and it was Alice in Chains, like the letter N, kind of like Guns N' Roses, but not like that, if you ask them. And they had called the band Alice in Chains, and I think that band only lasted a matter of a couple of months. And they were just more of like a glam metal band from that time period, which is kind of good that they didn't take off, because their career would have immediately been like destroyed 2 or 3 years later, They might have been riding high, might have got an album out, but I mean, after that, they would have been silenced, like a lot of the 80s bands were. So they reformed, or Lane Staley basically was living with Jerry Cantrell, and Jerry started another band that wasn't called Alice in Chains yet, and they kept trying out singers, and they kept trying to convince Lane to sing for the band, and he was just kind of shy about it, like he wasn't sure he wanted to do it. So they just auditioned a whole bunch of really bad singers in front of Lane, until he basically like had no choice but to be like, look, I'm gonna go ahead and front this band because all these guys are terrible. And so he called his old bandmates from the old Alice in Chains and was like, hey, we want to start this new band, but we want to call it Alice in Chains. And they're like, I guess whatever, because the band was broke up. So that's kind of the backstory to how that band was formed. And what we ended up getting was definitely not a glam metal band, but not really a grunge band either. But I'm going to defer to Jason here a little bit, because obviously I wasn't around at that time in that scene. Was it really like an overnight thing where people just didn't care about metal anymore?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this week, listening to all these albums. And, the funny thing about grunge and the term grunge, as someone who lives here and lived through that and grew up in these, I don't have a good definition for grunge. I do feel like Alice in Chains, out of all of the big 5 Seattle bands at the time, you have Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and maybe Candlebox. Those off the top of my head. Alice in Chains to me is probably the most grunge sounding, in that, for whatever that means. But see, because I live here, I also remember bands like the Melvins and Tad and some of these other bands that were a little bit more funky. And by funky, I mean like weird, obscure. And those are the bands that I kind of think are a little bit more grungy. Grunt Truck is another one. And so Alice in Chains to me is definitely a little bit on the heavier side, maybe grungier side, slower. But as to what that really means, I don't know, man. It's a bizarre term. I mean, because grunge also is a fashion thing too. Remember?
Yeah, all about the wallet chain, the flannel shirt, the ripped up jeans. It was definitely a fashion statement at that time. Yeah.
But I will say though, so you ask about sort of like, did they just happen and was it a big thing? And the answer to that is no. Is that initially the Seattle bands at the time were being passed around, by your friends. And so I remember specifically getting a cassette dub of Soundgarden's very first album from a cook at a hotel I was working at. And that's how that happened, is that there was this sort of underground music scene happening that people were starting to talk about and get excited about. But it was pretty rough because you also had Green River. You also had, was a Mother Love Bone at the time. I'm trying to remember kind of the history of all that stuff. So there were bands that were around and considered to be more popular. But then you started to get a little bit more heavier side. And that was definitely Soundgarden and Alice in Chains.
I remember in the mid-'90s when I really started to pay attention to some of those classic grunge bands like Alice in Chains and Melvins, Nirvana, obviously. For us, nu metal was happening in Missouri about that time, is when everybody started to pay attention to Korn, because somebody heard the song Adidas and it was the greatest thing ever. Grunge was always sold to me as punk rock with heavy metal distortion. So basically Melvins.
Yeah, or I always thought it had a little bit of a Black Sabbath kind of doom sound to it as well. If you listen to Soundgarden and also Alice in Chains, you definitely hear a little bit of the slower tempos, the longer kind of melodies that they sing, stuff like that. Even all these years later, when people mention grunge, I'm like, what? If you look up on Spotify or Apple Music, and they'll have like grunge playlists. I'm like, what? This is, it's all over the place. What?
And isn't that basically just Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Candlebox, like you mentioned earlier, and a little bit of Melvins?
And again, only half of those bands I would consider actually grunge, right? Because Candlebox was absolutely a 70s hard rock band, right?
Oh, yeah.
Pearl Jam have always said that they were influenced by and wanted to be Neil Young meets The Who. And if you listen to it, that's exactly kind of what they are, right? So, yeah, it's a weird term, but for me, I do, when someone mentions grunge, I'm like, okay, Alice in Chains, fine. That's cool. Let's do that.
I've always resisted it. Just because they came from Seattle in the early 90s, late 80s didn't make them grunge. They were a rock band, if that is what they were. Most of the time, their big singles had Jerry Cantrell and Lane singing over acoustic.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. Is Alice in Chains were, of all the bands, I think, very interesting in that they had a heavy side, but also a lot of acoustic to it, which no other band really did. Maybe Pearl Jam did a little bit, but not quite like Alice in Chains. They really flip-flop quite a bit.
Well, and this is what I find so interesting about it, is there's a certain narrative in my head that plays out with grunge, or the idea of grunge, or people saying that grunge music in the 90s killed metal from the 80s, which I think is largely kind of bullshit. I think maybe in the mainstream. Alice in Chains especially, whenever I listen to their stuff, especially their heavier songs, they're still very metal in their composition, and maybe in more of a Black Sabbath and less of like a Guns N' Roses. But they were very metal in the sense that their riffs were kind of like there's almost a little bit of bone crunching in some of the heavier songs, the darker melodies. I mean, they're a very melodic band, obviously, but not in a pretty sort of way, but more of a you're kind of feeling shitty walking down an alleyway and it's raining on you, sort of way. And so their music was very dark, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And it was dark and very metal, and like the guitar playing, the guitar tone, all of it is very much inspired by the decade of metal that came before it. It's just done in kind of their own way. And so I almost attribute that more just to the personality of the band members than I do, necessarily that it's a specific genre. And what I think is funny about it is that, when people say, oh, well, people weren't into metal anymore, 1990, maybe 1991 through 1995. And I'm like, yeah, but if you listen to some of these bands, like there's so much metal influence in what they're playing that it's hard to say that like, oh yeah, well it was like a straight 180 from that style. Because like, I mean, if that were the case, then everybody would have been playing new wave, right? Like,
well, and also, you know, in the 80s, all the hair metal bands were playing basically a heavier, distorted version of the blues.
Right.
Where along comes Alice in Chains with their first single, which was Man in the Box, which is basically a one chord, you know, riff. It's at E major. Well, I guess it's E flat, but it's E flat, you know, power chord. But what's interesting about it is that it has that high A in that, which gives it that little bit of kind of dissonance in that, and that's something that a lot of bands like Whitesnake and name the band of choice from the late 80s to the early 90s didn't do. And here comes Alice in Chains with just a very simple riff. It's a kind of riff where I think a lot of bands probably at the time were like, damn, I wish I'd have wrote that. You know what I mean? It's so simple.
Yeah, it's like I almost dropped my guitar and I grabbed it and hit I already played that this week. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, and I'm sure there was a lot of music snobs too that are like, we don't understand how this garbage is, you know, getting. Yeah. But I mean, that song is undeniable in its simplicity and its catchiness and just the strong vocal.
Those are the best songs, right? It's like, you know, when they talk about Black Sabbath Paranoid, it's like they needed one extra song in the recording studio. They went and made it up on the fly, and it's like one of the best Black Sabbath songs ever, you know? And so sometimes the best songs are like that. It's funny because actually Kim Thale, who is the guitarist for Soundgarden, he famously had a guitar that he never ever changed the strings on, which is something you would not do as a guitarist because they'll break. But he basically loved the tone. And so a lot of the classic Soundgarden songs are actually written on a guitar that has like strings on it that will shred your fingers because they're so rusty, but they had that sound.
It's hurting me just thinking about it.
I can't imagine. I break strings all the time, so I know I'm like, but it's that sort of stuff. I mean, obviously, Kurt Cobain was very famous for playing a Sears guitar, you know, that barely stayed in tune.
Radio Shack speakers.
Is that what it was? Yeah, it was like crazy.
Talking about composition, Man in the Box was almost anti-80s with its composition. Most of the guitar riffs and the song structures were all based around fourths and fifths. The guitarist kind of abandoned the root.
Oh, I was just going to say, because he very famously did it on a song on Jar of Flies. I think it's called Nutshell, where it basically starts, the whole riff starts, I believe, on the fourth, which is kind of weird. But because it's in sync with the drums, it works really well, you know?
That has to be just Jerry Cantrell's brain of, how can I make this song sound dirty when I'm basically the only guitarist?
Right, yeah.
So what did we... oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so should we jump into our thoughts about Facelift?
Yeah, that's right where I was going, so you read my mind. Yeah, no, we're same page.
1990, Facelift. Watch out for the clown on the cover.
This, you know, so listening back to this album for this podcast, I had similar feelings as I did when I first came out. And that is, there are some absolute classics on here, and there's also some songs where I'm like, next, you know what I mean? I don't know if that's sacrilege, but it's a great intro, but they also have those songs where it kind of meanders a little bit. And that's, I don't know if that's going to piss off some people, but I guess the answer is that I love parts of it, and then parts of it are like, I don't know. Your thoughts?
I agree with you 100%. I just wanted to stay silent to make you as uncomfortable as possible while making those statements.
I was like, oh shit.
No, I'm with you though, 100%. Like, Facelift is a great introductory album for Alice in Chains, but it is by no means their finest work.
Agreed.
I think there's a reason the majority of people know Alice in Chains from the greatest hits that came out right around 2000. Because the best songs on the albums and the EPs kind of make up the overall essence of Alice in Chains. When I listen to Sea of Sorrow, it's a good song, but I started to realize how many Sea of Sorrow exists in Jerry Cantrell's history, especially on the newer albums. I feel like I've heard this song 5 times this week. Nothing wrong with it if you're a fan of that, and I definitely am, but Man in the Box, Bleed the Freak. There's a reason why these are the songs everybody goes to when they think of Alice in Chains.
Yeah, and not to be that guy, but this album basically is Man in the Box and Bleed the Freak for me. And Bleed the Freak, interestingly enough, because it was more of a preview of what the Alice in Chains sound was going to be going forward. Man in the Box is a fucking great song, don't get me wrong. But this album is still mainly sung by one singer, which makes it a little bit more one-dimensional. Now, granted, at the time, we didn't see it that way because we hadn't heard Dirt. We hadn't heard, really where the band was going to go. So it's not that Facelift was a bad album. I guess I want to say that it was a really good album for the year that it came out. But because this band gets so much better as they go, it kind of falls behind. And Bleed the Freak was one of the first times you start hearing that harmonized vocal and it being part of the hook and it getting just stuck in your head to the point where, like, you're humming it for weeks and not even remembering what it is you're humming. And so that song really stands out to me as the top cut on the album, even if Man in the Box was the bigger hit. And I totally understand why it was.
Now, after Facelift, doesn't Sap come next?
Yes, you're correct. That came out before Dirt.
Okay. I'm trying to remember. So Sap to me was, and listening back again, is an EP, and it's almost all acoustic, if I remember right. And that's another one, too, where when I listen to it now, I appreciate it. There's parts of it I do like, but I'm not in love with it. I will say, though, that I absolutely love Ann Wilson of Heart on, I think she's the guest vocals on the first song, Brother. That was brilliant. I love that.
Yeah, that was done really well. Brother's awesome, and Am I Inside was really cool. It's just kind of more of an atmospheric. It's an atmospheric album. It's not even an album, but it's an atmospheric EP, and it's one of those deals where it gives us a little bit more of a preview of the elements that we're going to hear on Dirt. Yeah. And that's all it really was. I tend to view EPs as kind of like previews or like demos, so to speak. When you listen to an EP like that, you're kind of like, wow. If you were just like a meathead and you're like, no, I'm just here for the riffs, like the heavy, the heavy curb stomping riffs, you might hate an EP like Sap, and that is specifically why it's an EP and not they didn't stretch it out to a full length because I think that they at this point we're still like, we're not sure if the fans like the melodic side of Alice in Chains or if they just like the gritty, heavy stuff.
When it comes to Alice in Chains, because for a long time, they didn't have a lot of output, right? They had 3 main albums. And so I know for me as a fan that you end up counting Sap and then later on Jar of Flies almost like, well, we got something, you know what I mean? Like I think that's the reason why so many people go back and check out Sap and Jar of Flies, because it's like, man, they didn't put out a lot of songs, you get take it what you can get.
Yeah, I agree. And it's kind of funny too to see that type of tenacity on the part. It's either on the part of the band or on the part of the record label, but just to give the listeners and the fans more engaging content more quickly. Right. Like you look at, back then in the early 90s, it was acceptable to wait 2 or 3 years between albums coming out, and you didn't necessarily have to worry back then about being forgotten about or people moving on to the next thing. And so I think it was really cool that they did give us EPs between albums, that they did give us more content, whereas now in 2019, like you said, Jason, you put out 2 episodes a week, like consistent content. We put out an episode every single week, which is like almost impossible sometimes, and right. Because we're always worried, or at least I am always worried, that if we don't put out consistent content that we're going to get forgotten about, or that people will lose interest. And so it's funny to hear something back then almost have a more modern sort of approach to delivering content in a regular fashion. Yeah,
I agree. Also, I think too, it was pretty brave for them to put out a really mellow, down album like Sap in an era where it just nobody else did that. You either did Unplugged. I don't even know if Unplugged was a thing at the time, but you know what I mean. It was like that was Unplugged before Unplugged, right?
Yeah, totally. I think Unplugged came around 93. Okay. I'm just pulling that off the top of my head. It could be totally wrong, but
Unplugged was in 95.
Was it?
And that was shortly before, because Nirvana did it in 94. And I'm going to make sure I'm correct.
I was just talking about the show, not the
show.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking of Alice in Chains. Go.
Oh, okay. You were thinking on topic, and I was thinking on...
Is there another band other than Alice in Chains that we think of their entire discography as the albums and the EPs?
Yeah, for me, it seems like lately, a lot of bands, when they put out an EP, it's cover songs, right? It's something for Record Store Day that they kind of just put out at a limited number, but not all original music like this. And most bands don't really do this anymore, do they?
Not really. Not that I've seen. If they do, they're older bands that kind of have the older mindset. Because to me, an EP is just kind of a half step. It's like a 1.5,
right?
You know, or whatever, like a way to lead you in. Or in certain cases, a band will put out an EP because they're like, this material just doesn't fit in our overall catalog. And I think that's very much true with Sap. That it's an EP that they're like, we don't know what to do with these songs. If we put a whole album out like this, we might lose people. But you know, as an EP, it's fine.
And Hailstorm does that what they do is they put out a proper album, and then in between albums they put out, I forget what they called them, but basically they're EPs of covers.
Yeah.
And so they've covered Metallica and, you know, Marilyn Manson and everybody like that. But again, it wouldn't fit on their proper albums. Actually, I think Stone Sour does that as well. Where
they do, yeah.
But it's mostly kind of like for Record Store Day thing, you know.
Yeah, I mean, whatever they're doing is working. You know, it's not my preference. I get a little frustrated, you know, if I pay money for something. I don't know if anybody else still buys records or not, but to me, if I buy like a 7-inch or a 10-inch vinyl or something on Record Store Day, I'm a little irritated if like it's like one new song, like a new single, and then it's like 8 cover songs. I'm just kind of like, okay. I mean, it's okay if it's a band that like we just did a Between the Buried and Me episode, and I loved hearing their covers album. But it was like a full-fledged release. It wasn't like kind of more of a gimmicky deal. And it's not to say that those, I mean, obviously whatever those bands are doing, they're doing it more successfully than I'm doing in my career. But so just have to throw that side note out there, you know. They've sold more units than I ever have. But yeah, I really appreciated it more whenever it was the band kind of either experimenting with their sound or they were giving us a preview. I'm even okay with an EP where like 2 of the songs end up on the full length that comes out a year later.
Yeah.
1992. Dirt.
Holy shit.
I think it's safe to say that the reason why we're talking about Alice in Chains today is because of Dirt.
You're not wrong.
I know for me personally, Dirt was one of the greatest albums of that year. It continues to be one of the greatest Seattle, you know, Alice in Chains albums, obviously Seattle, that era, 1990s. For me, it's their masterpiece. Every song on there is it stands out. It's creative, it's heavy, it's beautiful, it's heartbreaking. Everything is thrown into this album.
This is the album that taught me Lane wasn't just a singer with a different attitude. He actually wrote some of at least the foundations of some of the biggest songs. Angry Chair, Wood. He may have actually had a piece in Junkhead too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it looks like he's credited on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the tracks. Some of them he co-wrote with Cantrell, but yeah.
Can you even name a better album opener than Them Bones? I mean, holy shit! Like, if you loved Facelift, they've topped that album with that song. You're 2 minutes into the new album, and you've already got a better vibe going than you had on the entire previous album. That's not very common. Like me being kind of a fanboy music listener that only likes shit to be the same. You know, the band's first album's the best one, and that's what it's supposed to sound like. I'll go on and on for hours about that stuff. But in this particular case, this band has completely outdone themselves in one song. And then there's the rest of the album.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like the first time I ever heard Battery by Metallica. You know, like it's up there, you know, where you're like, oh my God, like you just did everything you did on the other album in 2 minutes, and now I've still got another hour to go. And yeah, this album is perfectly sequenced. I mean, just the transition between Them Bones and Damn That River. You know, you go into Down in a Hole, you go into Godsmack, Angry Chair, and then Wood closes it off in just as epic of a fashion that Them Bones opened it.
So we all love this album. So pick your top 2 tracks of this album.
Shit.
Top 2.
Rooster.
Really? Okay.
Them Bones.
Nice.
This is really hard. I got to pick 2 out of 13.
I can tell you're not going to pick Godsmack.
I'm not going to pick Godsmack. Just out of principle. Fuck. See, you're making me choose between Them Bones, Wood, and Angry Chair.
Angry Chair. That's a good one.
I'm thinking I'm gonna do Angry Chair and Wood because they end it off. And they end it off in such a spectacular fashion that I'm just literally ready to hit play again when the CD's over. If anybody in 2019 knows what I'm talking about, when a CD ends and you have to start it over.
You know that thing's got repeat on it, right?
Actually, in my case, it was like, sweet, I can just take the tape out and turn it over and put it back in, and I'm already rewound. Like those two songs end the album in such a spectacular fashion. I mean, Wood is one of the catchiest songs, but Angry Chair is just so heavy and oppressive that, like, and they hit you with that twin vocal attack, which was like one of the biggest sells of the album and largely is the Alice in Chains sound as we know them today. You know, like you can't, well, normally I would say you can't replicate that sound, but technically they did. But
over and over again. And over again.
With a different guy even. But just the way this album is, those vocals are so almost mind-bending. Like it's almost like trippy the way they sound together and the way they kind of play off of each other. And it gives a much stronger vocal approach for the album as a whole than what you'd had on Facelift, which was largely just Lane singing, which was fine. But that's the difference between like a band that's good and a band that's great.
I think we've all picked different songs here. So obviously I could pick any one of these tracks, 13 tracks. Angry Chair, for a long time, that was my song. I love that song and the way that they bend the guitar and the harmonizing. But the songs I keep coming back to, Down in a Hole is just so depressing and so it's a mellow song that's angry, and it says a lot about how he sings those lyrics, and it's just one of those songs where I absolutely love. But my favorite song, and I was listening to it this week over and over again, is Rain When I Die. And that's another mid-tempo song that just gets angrier as it goes along. And by the end of it, he is just belting that out. And I don't know, there's something magic. It's funny because when I hear Rain When I Die, I'm reminded of when I used to commute from SeaTac over to Sierra at the time, and I'd be in stop and go traffic just pissed off, and Dirt was on the radio, and I'll never forget this. I was screaming it in my car. And you know how when you look ahead and you can see someone's rearview mirror and you can see their eyeballs? This lady was looking back at me like I was an insane person.
Oh my God, there's this crazy metalhead behind me and he's screaming.
Yeah, because it was like in the middle of summer, my windows were rolled down and this album was cranked, but it was just soothing my soul. It was just something that I needed to listen to as I was commuting. So Rain but again, I could pick any song. I like Sick Man as well because of that kind of the drumming and the riff is like crazy. It's like very unique. So a classic album, man. It's awesome.
It's a perfect album. I'll say it. We don't say it too often, but it is a perfect album. Nothing they could change about it to make it better.
I would agree. Even the B-sides and even sort of the lesser known songs, I think fit within, their they're just, I don't know, this whole album just fits together. It's awesome.
They're the lesser known songs, but nothing on this album sounds like filler. Very often you'll listen to a record and half of it is really good and the other half feels like the songs they picked to take up space so they could put out a full-length album. This does not sound that way. It does not feel that way. This is the first time that you get a glimpse into the whatever Lane and Jerry are tapping into when they put these songs together. I remember when we talked to Chad Kent, he talked about Nathan, that he was able to let the drums breathe and let the atmosphere of the song be what it was without just taking up all the attention with the guitar. I feel like Jerry and Lane have a way when those two minds, those two voices got together. What you got out of it has not been recreated, and the closest thing we're going to get to it is the fact that Jerry Cantrell is still writing music.
Right.
I would be remiss if we didn't talk about Jar of Flies.
You guys are murdering my no EP rule.
Well, I have to put my hand up for this. It's like, because Jar of Flies it's a half an hour long, it's 7 songs, and it's just excellent. And again, I think it's way better than Sap. I think it's got more energy. The songs are better. I mentioned Nutshell previously, and that's just track number 2, and that just has a simple guitar chord progression that every single time I pick up an acoustic guitar, that's what I play. I love that track. That's a great track. Also, I want to mention too, I think it's No Excuses, where it has this drum start to it, which kind of reminds me a little bit of Stuart Copeland from The Police because it's so snappy. It's a brilliant album.
We talked to Toby Wright at Rockin' Pod this year. He mentioned that the production process for this album started with, "Hey Toby, can we come to the studio? We got some songs." And then after they showed up, he asked Jerry about the songs he had, and the response he got was, "Yeah, I don't have any."
Oh,
So
really?
do you mind if we just jam? So what we got out of Jar of Flies was Alice in Chains jamming in the studio being recorded. Remember what I said about the emotion, whatever Jerry and Lane are tapped into, and it's the band as a whole. I don't want to take away from one person because I can't think of another band that has a drummer that plays this way, bass that sounds like this, guitar and vocals together. And it's also the one band I can think of where no one really complains that the lead singer doesn't primarily sing. I don't even have words for this part of the discography because you need to listen to Jar of Flies if you haven't. It has I Stay Away on it. It has Nutshell. I think they were somewhere else than where they were on Facelift. I just don't think I'm allowed to go there.
I think it largely succeeds because it's an actual Alice in Chains release. Regardless of how it was created or what the circumstances were on how they came up with those songs, I think it succeeds where Sap didn't, in the sense that you are basically getting a continuation of this band's sound. Like, yeah, sure, is there a little bit more experimentation in it? Sure. Because they're just jamming. They're just going with what worked at that exact moment. But this album still has a little bit more of the grit that Alice in Chains was known for. If I had to pick between the two EPs, I probably would still go with Sap. I know it's kind of a weird...
Really?
Yeah, it's kind of a weird digression.
You can get out of my house.
All right, well, you guys have fun doing the rest of the episode. But
Sap is a very depressing, low-energy album. And is that the reason why you dig it?
That's why I like it, because it's very dark.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Jar of Flies is a little bit more positive in the sense that, like I Stay Away is a little positive. And I mean, I'm just the kind of guy that doesn't go to hard rock and metal for the positive vibe, even though I listen to like dream pop and shit like that. But like, it's still like when I'm listening to a band like Alice in Chains, I'm usually listening to them when I'm in a bad mood. And the idea isn't necessarily to cheer me up. Right. It's just to kind of revel in your own shit, I guess, so to speak. That's why bands like this are so universal, because they are putting to music feelings that we all already have. Yeah. So whenever a song like I Stay Away comes on, I'm just kind of like, okay, yeah, cool. We're on a farm and, there's birds lifting off from a lake. That's the kind of visual I get from it. And I'm just like, I don't know, man, this just really isn't my thing. I want to go back to City Street getting rained on. And you get a little bit of that in Jar of Flies, but to me, Sap is ultimate as far as like me reveling in my own shit, if that's a thing.
And what's cool is that in the later years, they've been packaging those two EPs together. So if you go and you buy the vinyl, you get both, which is together, that is a pretty great album, for sure. The one thing I want to mention before we move on, though, from Jar of Flies and Dirt, is that we would be remiss to not mention one of the best soundtrack songs that they ever made, which was What the Hell Have I?
Oh, yeah.
For the Last Action Hero soundtrack.
I'm really glad you brought that up because I probably wouldn't have on my own.
Yeah, I think it ended up on the box set, but for a while
it's in the music. It's in the music vault.
In the music vault. Okay, cool. But I love that song. The sitar sound that they got.
Yeah,
it's cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. And what's interesting too about that music vault, if we can talk about that for a second, there's actually a point-and-click adventure game in the music vault on the last disc. Yeah,
is it really?
I'm not kidding at all.
Well, I should live stream that.
Yeah, you have to rescue all the band members, I think, from hell. It's been a few years. Yeah, it's like, make sure to play it on your Win98 machine because it will not. You can't just pop it in your PC and play it now. But back whenever that came out, I remember putting it in and it being like, there's extra content on this disc, and I put it in and it was an actual like point and click, like a Myst type of game. And yeah, your whole thing is to rescue all the band members' souls from hell. It's not the best game I've ever played in my life, but
sure.
the fucking novelty is
Yeah,
like
that's
through
awesome.
the roof. But
Beats the hell out of Aerosmith's point and click roller coaster thing.
yeah, I don't think it's better than Ed Hunter though that Iron Maiden put out. I don't know if you ever played Ed Hunter.
Isn't that a first-person shooter type thing?
Yeah, so you basically chase Ed through all these different time periods.
Huh.
It's fun.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. But no, What the Hell Am I is a really cool song. And I remember too because I actually had bought the Music Vault before I had all the Alice in Chains albums. So a lot of those songs were like really new to me. And I remember actually being pissed off that I couldn't find that song on an album.
Yeah,
after that.
It's such a great song. It should have been on one of their albums.
But the reason I mentioned the game is I believe that song actually plays as the background music for the game.
So I wouldn't be able to live stream it because I'd get a copyright claim in like 10 seconds.
I don't know, man. We play music on our show the whole time we're talking, and
Yeah,
I think
true.
the fact that we're talking over it defeats the waveform, like beats the waveform, and they don't see it.
Yeah,
but
that's probably true.
yeah, except that one time. We played like 15 seconds of a song. We played 15 seconds of a song and bam, copyright strike. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I have to worry about that all the time.
That's why you make your own music and use your own music as background.
You are absolutely right.
Are we ready to talk about Alice in Chains?
I think we are.
The album, not the band. We've been doing that the whole time.
The band and the album.
Starts off with Grind. It's not another Dirt. It's not another Them Bones. But it's okay. After Jar of Flies, I'll take this. Plus, it has Sludge Factory on it.
This I remember when this came out, bought it day one, huge anticipation, and I remember sitting in my car listening to it going, okay, it's hard to follow up Dirt. That's the thing. It's hard to follow up Dirt. So this is not Dirt.
It's another release by Alice in Chains. I'm here for it. I love every minute of it. It has Heaven Beside You on it.
Wait, you do love this album?
I do.
Really? Okay.
I don't think there's really anything wrong with it. I think it gets a bad rap because it's not Dirt, and I think that's unfair. You've got Heaven Beside You, Frogs, Again, Sludge Factory, Grind. You can't say it's as good as Dirt, but you also can't say it's bad because it has just as many memorable songs by Alice in Chains on it.
My favorite track on this actually is the hidden track on here, the last one, Over Now. Now they played this on Unplugged, but for a while this was kind of like the unplayed song for a while, and that's the one that's more like their previous albums, I think.
I thought that was Queen of the Rodeo.
Oh. Oh my God, yeah. Wait, that's not on this album though. What was that on?
It was on the live album for a while, and then it eventually showed up on the box set in a studio recording, basically a demo.
Right. Oh my God, I haven't heard that in a long time. Wow.
And we're going to pause for Jason to listen to Queen of the Rodeo.
3.5 minutes later. Yeah, I'm definitely not in the Joe camp on this one. This album was largely a stinker for me. It's not a stinker. It doesn't suck. They didn't fuck up. It's not like that. It's not Dirt.
It's not your Alice in Chains.
Dirt was the perfect album. It's more like Facelift, but
Yes.
I think I like it more than
agree.
Facelift.
I would
Just
agree.
because just the band's experience, they're going to put out a better album than their debut, just because of the passage of time alone. But yeah, there's just not as many memorable songs on this one. And it's definitely one of those, like, when I'm listening to it, I can't just put it on and, like, keep painting the garage or, do, like, a project or whatever. It's an album that, in order for me to really enjoy it, I have to sit down with the lyrics and pay attention to it. And, like, sometimes I have time for that, but, like, I have 3 kids, so I don't have any time. So whenever I listen to something like the self-titled Alice in Chains, I'm like, this is cool, but I kind of just want to hear the hits, and I don't really want to jump into the deep dives too much. And I think this album's cool, but it's definitely not going to be my first choice. I was talking to a buddy of mine from another podcast earlier today, and I was like, yeah, I was checking out, this album, and he's like, yeah, the problem is I went to listen to that album a few times recently, and I just end up listening to Dirt, and I'm like, yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, that's cool that you like it, actually, because that's I don't think that's the common consensus, but yeah, it's interesting. It's cool. It's cool you were able to dig in there and find stuff that wasn't filler for you.
It's a deep cut type of album. That's the problem, is that like you can, again, it's not an album that I'm listening to all the time, but I feel like if you sit down and do the work, you can find some enjoyable stuff. The problem is, as a music fan, like to be a music reviewer is one thing, to be a music fan, the music fan shouldn't have to do the work to find the good, if that makes sense. Like it should just kind of be out there for you. So, and it is that way on Dirt. Alice in Chains, you kind of have to really kind of put yourself in a certain mindset to like it. I'm being really nice. Like, I don't think that the album's like a pile of shit, but like I don't hate it, but I don't love it either.
Isn't that the same thing you end up doing with Load and Reload, though?
Yeah, but I mean, I would even argue that Load and Reload had better songs than this.
You could sit down and listen to those albums today.
Yeah. I mean,
I could listen to this.
I'm not going to, but yeah, you could. You could say that.
Why don't you step into the house that Jack built? Sorry, I'm in my jar of flies.
So this was it, right? I mean, this was basically it for the original Alice in Chains.
This was it.
I would say, though, that, again, I know you guys typically on your show don't cover live albums and compilations, but we mentioned it briefly, Unplugged. And I think it's important for us to mention that Unplugged was a huge Alice in Chains album.
I'm going to allow it because this and Nirvana are considered to be the pinnacle of the Unplugged release. Yeah,
I agree. And, and it says a lot about Alice in Chains. Obviously, they were doing acoustic songs anyway, so this wasn't a huge stretch, but they also brought in some of the songs from obviously the Alice in Chains album and some of their heavier stuff and made them fit within that format. I mean, it just showed how brilliant they were. I recently rewatched it for this podcast, and I was taken aback by several things. One, just how raw and vulnerable Lane is on that show. It's heartbreaking to watch because he's not going to live much longer.
It's not going to be much further after that.
But it's a great performance. I almost feel like when I was watching it, like, wow, they're not really performing. He's just we're watching him do poetry almost sometimes during that. It was a really wild performance. But yet the band around him is fantastic. A huge shout out to the bassist, Mike Inez, because several of these songs, his bass playing is all over that, like in those songs, and it really comes through in the unplugged version of them. So anyways, I just want to kind of mention, I don't know what you guys feel about Unplugged.
No, it is. He's exposed. I'm basically just tearing open his soul for us to see in that one performance. And that's what I liked about the Unplugged series across a lot of the bands that did it. But yeah, like Joe said, there's something about the Nirvana and the Alice in Chains where you're almost feeling like you're seeing the definitive version of some of those songs.
Yeah.
Even the acoustic version of Wood, which I went in thinking like, how they going to play that song without any distortion? That doesn't make any sense. But it worked.
That's why Unplugged was so great, though, because the original premise was not an artist showing up and playing acoustic songs. It was taking someone who is known for not doing that and taking away all of their crutches. You don't have distortion. Yep. Can you actually show up and play music? And they did.
Are the songs good, right? Because with the distortion and all the noise behind you, it's easy to skate by on a weak song. But when it's acoustic, man, it's just you out there,
And then you get your Kurt Cobains and your Alice in Chains that show up and just sneak a little bit of distortion and effects in because, well, you didn't see that coming.
Yeah, I joked about that, especially on the Nirvana one. It's worse than it is even on the Alice in Chains. Well, you're like, yeah, they definitely plugged some shit in for some of this.
Right, but you wouldn't have Chris Squire show up and tell him to turn off his chorus pedal either.
Right, yeah, and I get it. But it was still just it's just still kind of funny that, like, yeah, there's still electronic elements
It's
to
unplugged, man. You're not allowed to use all those effects. Do you know who I am?
Right.
Do you see this Rickenbacker bass? I am Chris Squire of Yes.
Yeah,
that's true. Speaking of which, did you guys ever see the Cure one when they performed?
Yeah,
where they basically just had the children's like little musical instruments. It was not a brilliant performance, but I appreciated what they're going for.
Now, did you watch the Korn Unplugged where the Cure showed up and did a mashup?
No, I had no idea.
You need to look that up. The opening of the show, they do Blind, but they do it like a samba.
Really? Okay, I'll have to check that out.
That was very interesting. Yeah, I think the whole thing's up on YouTube or something.
The entire orchestra is wearing like rabbit masks.
Okay, I'll check that out.
So it's got that Wicker Man thing going on.
Yeah, I think they mash up Korn's "Make Me Bad" with the Cure. What's What song did he sing? It's been like a year since I watched that. But anyway, yeah,
He sang "Freak on a Leash" with Amy Lee.
That was could have done without that. But yeah, anyway. So back on a band that we do like. So following the Unplugged performance, that's really, I mean, I know they toured for a while after that, but this was basically it for the band as far as releases go. I don't know what was going on in everybody's personal lives, but I know Jerry Cantrell went off and did a whole bunch of solo stuff after this, which is actually pretty good. If you're into stuff like Sap or Jar of Flies or whatever, it's like a lot of stuff like that, and full albums. And a lot of people basically were like, "Well, I guess this is just what Alice in Chains is going to be." And then in 2002, signal the record scratch or whatever, but Lane Staley was found dead from a heroin overdose. I think that, I don't even know what to say to that. Like, it's just
we all wanted Alice in Chains to come back and perform. There was a time where it was because Lane couldn't or wouldn't. I didn't know him personally, so I can't comment. But then when he's gone, it's, well, I guess Alice in Chains is done then.
And they were done for a while. I mean, for like, what, 10, 14 years, something like that? It was a while.
Yeah.
In between their last album and a reunion.
Well, I know. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I know for me personally, I'd given up hope on an Alice in Chains anything, really, and it's just one of those things where a lot of those bands, like I guess I would feel the same way, like, for instance, these days with Soundgarden. I don't think, I'd be shocked if another Soundgarden comes back. How are you going to replace somebody, a great front person like that? And that's not to say that it can't happen. Everyone always looks back to AC/DC, and the transition from Bon Scott to Brian Johnson was brilliant. But the thing is that they had really strong music to make that happen, and they didn't try to replace Bon Scott, who cannot be replaced, right? They got somebody totally different, and I think that's the reason why it worked. The songs were strong. So who knows? Who knows if Soundgarden will come back and, we transitioned into a reunion or a reboot of Alice in Chains, right? Fairly recently.
2009.
Well, what I think the big difference between like a Soundgarden and Alice in Chains is as horrible as this is going to sound, and I don't mean it with any disrespect to Lane at all, but he was, in a sense, at this point, or at least at the last point in the band's career, only part of the puzzle.
Yeah.
So in the case of like a Soundgarden, it's you can't replace Chris Cornell because he was the whole package as far as the vocal delivery of that band goes. Whereas Jerry Cantrell had already been putting out shit that sounded kind of like Alice in Chains for years. So it's not impossible to make the jump that, like, well, maybe they could replace Lane and it might be okay. Now, historically, for most bands, it's not okay. It ends up not being okay. For some reason, this worked.
I remember the first performances after they reunited, where they invited up a lot of their peers. Like, I remember James Hetfield went up and played Wood. But I noticed right away that the songs sounded the same, and the camera, for whatever reason, just stayed on Jerry. And I kept asking myself, who's singing? Because it sounds like Lane. It sounds disgustingly like Lane.
Well, I know for me, whenever I forget what the reboot album was, what Black Gives Way to Blue. I bought it when it came out, and actually I was pleasantly surprised. Even listening to this album today, I think it's pretty good. I think I definitely like it more than the self-titled Alice in Chains album.
I would largely agree because, first of all, there's two different parameters going on here. When you're listening to self-titled Alice in Chains, it's the original band, and so you're comparing it to Dirt. Whenever you get to Black Gives Way to Blue, it's been 14 years since we've heard an Alice in Chains record. You now know that there's a new lead singer, and William Duvall, and you're asking yourself, is this going to sound like Alice in Chains? And within the first 10 seconds, you're like, oh, God, yes, okay, it does.
Yeah.
And so you're almost satisfied on a purely...
cosmetic?
Yes, you're satisfied on a purely cosmetic level.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that this is... this picks up. It has energy that the previous album lacked. All Secrets Known, I liked immediately. Check My Brain is a really kick-ass tune. Last of My Kind, Your Decision. Just the first 4 songs on this, I think, are really good Alice in Chains songs. And, you don't have to apologize. You don't have to say, but it doesn't have a lane. No, these are good tunes.
So with William Duvall, Elephant in the Room, is it weird that they found somebody that sounded as much like Lane as they did? They don't sound exactly the same. And it's weird because when I first heard these albums, I was like, oh my God, he sounds exactly the same. But then this week I had to listen to all of it. So I was like, okay, so it's not exactly the same.
Most of what you hear that you think sounds the same is Jerry Cantrell.
Yeah.
Which to me gave me a whole new perspective on the older releases. I had to go back and listen and say, wow, a lot of what I thought was Lane and Jerry.
Yep. I think we all kind of were surprised to hear that. It's like, oh, wow, okay, so Jerry was more of the sound than we realized, A lot of bands do this, though. Look at Journey. Journey did the exact same thing. They get a guy who sounds just like Steve Perry, fantastic singer. Judas Priest obviously did this very famously.
Tim the Ripper Owens.
Yeah, and so, and to your point, having listened to all of this stuff this week, going back to Sap and hearing Ann Wilson of Heart, part of me was like, what wouldn't have been cool if they would have, instead of gone for someone who sounds just like Lane, but actually just go the opposite route and get like a kick-ass female singer or somebody who would just put a stake in the ground and say, this is the new band going forward. I almost, to your point, and maybe this is your point, I kind of wish that they did that they went the AC/DC route and said, you know what, we don't need somebody who sounds just like Lane. We're going to get somebody who is going to do Alice in Chains 2.0.
I agree with what you're saying, but I would more agree with it in 1996 or 1997, right after they'd put out the self-titled, and then let's say they got another singer for whatever reason. They were in the same place, and they're like, well, I think the time is when the band is still fresh to reboot the band. But what we're suggesting too is a little risky. And not a little risky, it's one of the most risky things you can do as an established band is to hire on a new lead singer that takes the band in a totally different direction. Because even though we all know, like even as a singer of a band myself for a while, it's not really the singer's fault why the music goes the way that it goes, unless they're like a principal songwriter. But they're largely still going to get blamed for whatever changes do take place.
That's true. We saw that with Motley Crue big time.
100%. It's like, why? How is it the singer's fault? But for whatever reason, music fans see it that way. And so I think that they could have gotten away with it better than they would have gotten away with it in 2009, because it had been 14 years. You can't reboot the band after 14 years. Everybody that's checking your band out now, it's just because they loved you back in the 90s.
Yeah, fair point.
So you can't really, I mean, you can do whatever you want, but whatever might be successful is...
Jerry Cantrell can do whatever he wants.
Jerry Cantrell can do whatever he wants.
I've listened to Degradation Trip 1 and 2. He can do whatever he wants, and it will sound amazing.
I think this is really good. I don't know if it's amazing.
I actually don't think this album is that great for the new band. This record succeeds at being a Jerry Cantrell fronted release that has vocal harmonies in it that kind of remind me of older Alice in Chains. It was not until the next record that I said, okay, this is Alice in Chains. Are we ready for it?
Sure.
2013, The Devil Put Dinosaurs Here.
Can we do a show of hands who thinks that's probably one of the dumbest album titles of all time? I hate that title.
Can I tell you? Can I tell you what it means?
I
you know what it means.
I was raised evangelical.
Me too.
I know exactly
me too.
what. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just gonna see you guys in a minute.
Is that a reason why guys go on to become metalheads? I feel like there's like a direct connection there. Well, for any listeners that don't know, I'll keep this very brief. There's a certain contingency of the population that doesn't believe that the Earth is millions of years old or billions of years old. They don't believe in evolution. They don't believe in modern day science. So the explanation for why dinosaur bones exist is that the devil went back and put dinosaur bones in the ground in order to fool people into thinking that the Earth was millions of years old. So I'm going to go ahead and let you all just chew on that for a while, and we will move on.
Which, okay, but when you explain that, right, that you're like, okay, that's interesting, right? There's a discussion to be had there. But without context, when this came out, I was just like, come on, really? That's the album title that Queens of the Stone Age would use.
Right.
And they would get away with it because they're quirky and weird, right? But for Alice in Chains, it's just, I hate that title. I don't know.
It would have been fine if it had been like the name of their first demo or something,
right.
Like back when they were all young dudes and they're like, look at how weird we are, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I agree. Like, this is a very strange. They should have just called the album Hollow, you know, off of their single. Yep. And let me talk about Hollow for a minute. So I heard Hollow on the radio because it had been quite a few years. It had been about 4 years since they put out an album. And for whatever reason, I think my iPod died or my CD player ran out of batteries or something. I've always had bad luck with like in-car music players. So like a lot of the times I drive around in headphones, which is for some reason is still legal in Missouri. And my music player died, and I was like, all right, fuck it. So I'll just turn the radio on and see what's on the radio. And this song comes on, and I was like, is this an Alice in Chains song that like was like some B-side that I've never heard before?
You had the same reaction I did when I heard Say Yeah by The Urge at 6:30 in the morning the first time.
Well, yeah, it's like, but I was like, no, it can't be old Alice in Chains because it doesn't sound old. Like
right.
the riffs are too heavy. Like the production quality is so different now than it was then. It sounds super modern, but it sounds more like Alice in Chains than I've heard in a long time. And I was like, man, this song is dark, it's heavy, it's slow, it's sludgy. It hits all the right little bullet points of what you would want from an Alice in Chains song. And so it really set up an album that, again, has a really stupid title. It turns out to actually be really cool. But with the stupid title, you have to, like, tell people that that's an album that you like.
To that note, I didn't listen to this when it came out because I couldn't get past that stupid title.
You're like, no, sorry, guys. I'm out.
But going back for this podcast and listening to it, mostly for the first time, you know, like so much, I always feel like I'm making excuses for these later albums. And here's the thing. In my mind, I think Alice in Chains will just always have the best, greatest hits album ever. Like, they always have a couple songs off of them that are just awesome, inspired, fantastic. And then you have the slow, mid-tempo stuff that it doesn't have the anger and the energy of their early stuff. That's just how I feel. This album is where I start feeling that big time, especially towards the second half.
Well, these guys are like 100 years old now, too. So it's, you know, it's hard to get that aggression.
That should not be an excuse because we all know that Judas Priest's last album, Firepower, was fucking amazing.
Holy
right?
shit, was it amazing. Yeah.
Holy shit. And even like Megadeth, like Dystopia, like what the hell happened? Did they discover caffeine? Because those albums are awesome. So, you know, and Rob Halford's like, what, 70? I mean, so I hear what you're saying. Older bands, they lose their fire. They lose that, you know, fire in the belly, that stuff. But it doesn't have to be.
Don't forget Hardwired.
Well, and this is also where we have to split hairs. I think Hardwired sounds kind of tired. But anyway, so this is where we split hairs, though, and say, well, how much of that righteous anger, so to speak, was Lane and how much of it was Jerry? And just looking at these albums alone, well, Lane clearly, I mean, especially looking at, you know, just his life, clearly had the bigger inner turmoil.
Yeah.
Than, you know, it sucks, too, because, like, you hate that. This is where it's hard to talk about because whenever a band puts out a perfectly serviceable album like this, and I'm like, yeah, but it's not angry and it's not anguish and it's not this or that. But then you're like, well, this is also an individual that died and lived a very hard life. But it's like, God damn, does it make great art? You know? And so that's kind of the shitty part of it. But I totally understand. I think musically, like if you're a hardcore like guitar guy, I think there's more to enjoy from these albums. But if you're just a hardcore like fan of music in general, I think these albums are going to sound cosmetically like Alice in Chains. But I think the original core of it is kind of missing.
A piece of it. I can agree with that. But Jerry Cantrell's here doing exactly what he did before. He's playing slow when it makes sense. He's playing faster when it makes sense. He's ominously adding to the composition as a whole, but it does sound more like just his solo work than Alice in Chains or Dirt or Facelift, Jar of Flies would sound if Lane was involved. And maybe that is because they worked so well together because they complemented each other in that essence that I talked about that I'm not allowed to understand. Sometimes I think Jerry Cantrell just writes his songs in reverse. You ever write just a basic chord structure that you think sounds good, and then you try to add a vocal line to it, and you end up with something that's very monotone and generic, and then listen to Alice in Chains and realize that the guitar is actually very monotone and generic, and it bends in a few places, but the vocals go all over the place? Sometimes I wonder, does Jerry just write his songs and then flip the instrumentation?
Well, and you're kind of touched on something here that, Alice in Chains used to be that they were very creative in their guitar riffs and musically. Like, we mentioned Angry Chair. I mean, that is just, there's nothing else like Angry Chair. And I think that they tried getting to parts of that, but back then they were the whole package. And now I can put on, we haven't got to the third album yet, but I can put on these 3 albums and I wouldn't even know which one I'm listening to, let alone, when they came out, or they just all kind of, again, they're actually fairly decent albums. There's very few standout tracks for me.
They all serve the same purpose, where I think they're trying to still sell us on the idea of we're Alice in Chains and we're back. And each of the albums, even individually, don't grow off of each other like a normal progression of bands' albums would do. Instead, It's more like, okay, here's our 2009 release. Check it out, we're Alice in Chains, we're back. And then they come back in the 2013 release and they're like, check it out, we're Alice in Chains and we're back. And then here's 2018, hey, we're back. And it's like, there's no actual musical progression between these 3 albums. Every single one of them feels like a reunion album.
The other thing I would mention too, and I know we're not at the third album, but I really noticed it at the third album, the one that just came out, called Rainier Fog, is that I stopped being able to tell when it was William and when it was Jerry, that I felt like the vocals were starting to really meld together in a way that Lane didn't do back in the day. That when you listen to their most current album compared to Dirt, Lane is there. You're hearing Lane, you're hearing his pain, but you're missing all that in the current stuff. It's almost like it's too meshed together. I think that's why I kind of feel like I wish they did have another singer that didn't sound like Lane, that would stand on their own, would be that person who would be the front person that you could kind of latch on to.
So is the modern Alice in Chains missing the tragedy that Lane had?
Well, yes, maybe. I mean, I don't claim to know the band, but I suspect that when it came time to put a band together, they probably were looking for someone who's not a heavy drug user and could probably hang out and, sit on the tour bus with them. And, and that's all completely reasonable for sure. Absolutely. They should do that. That's healthy. But we all know that some of the best albums of all time have been created from conflict and from some of, those things that put a little bit of fire in your belly. A great example of this, and it's nowhere near what your audience would probably listen to, but, Fleetwood Mac's greatest album, Rumors, was created when 2 of the 4 were getting a divorce and they couldn't stand each other. They hated each other.
And they were writing songs about how much they hated each other that they then had to sing together.
Yes, exactly. And so, would you say, well, is it fair that you guys, that the 2 marriages broke up? No, of course I would never want that, but damn, it makes some awesome art.
But can you think of another band that still showed up to write the new songs? I can't think of another one other than Fleetwood Mac. Meaning that Fleetwood Mac's the only band I can think of where they were having that conflict. The relationship was ending, but then it's Monday. We still got to go to the studio and write new songs.
They still came to work. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that shows their dedication towards obviously the craft of music and their careers and all that. I mean, for sure. That's, I think probably the only other band that comes to mind, I once read, I think it's Steven Tyler's autobiography from Aerosmith. And, Aerosmith had a lot of turmoil, a lot of drugs back in, and again, most of what we consider to be some of their best music came from that era. And it sucks that they had to go through that. But so I don't know, getting back to Alice in Chains, maybe things are a little bit too comfortable. I don't know, I'm not in that camp, right?
Right, and there's also that time frame that Jerry Cantrell wasn't releasing music. He was still visible. You could catch him in a guest appearance here and there. I'm reminded of when Dave Grohl finally talked about how he dealt with Kurt Cobain's death, and his answer was very simple. I didn't want to talk about it, so I made my own music. I wonder if Jerry's portion of that would be, Lane's not here. He was the other half of my essence, and I couldn't perform. So maybe Alice in Chains today is all the music Jerry wanted to release along the way. And I say him singularly, and I mean the band as a whole, I really do, because to my knowledge, none of them did anything outside of Alice in Chains. So if the new record sounds like Jerry Cantrell's solo album, well, then that's what we would have gotten before, and I think it would have been received negatively. I liked Degradation Trip, but I don't ever hear anybody bring it up.
Right.
Well, and I think to sum it up, I know we didn't do a specific section for the last album, but we've kind of been talking about all three of them as a whole, which I think is fair. One of the biggest things about these albums, though, is that most bands, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So if you get back together after 15 years and release an album, maybe some of your old fan base is going to love it, maybe they're not. But I have to at least give it to them for putting out a consistently good sounding product and not really hitting a lot of the missteps that a lot of other bands would do. But I agree with Jason in that, maybe this is the time where you start trying to branch out more. Now that maybe put out that first album that sounds just like old Alice in Chains, and then on the next one you kind of start incorporating your current selves into what it sounds like. Because where you get with the third album, which is called Rainy Fog, it's
Rainier
Fog, sorry. Whenever you get to Rainier Fog, you've basically got... I completely lost my point.
Well, I would say, and I think what you're getting at is that let's put it this way: if they put out 3 more of these type of albums, I think they're going to lose their base. I think they lose their audience. I think people will be kind of like, okay, what else you got? You know what I mean?
You've been using the same bag of tricks now for 30 years.
Right.
Let's hear something new.
And every band runs into this. Everyone who's does something creative, you have to kind of find that spark. You have to kind of find the next thing. They're certainly not alone, and some bands can do that and some can't. And again, not to say that these last 3 albums are bad. I actually think that they work just shuffled and randomized. They're not bad. They're just not great.
They've got some good playlist songs on them, sure. Which is kind of weird then, because we've talked about 6 albums by the band and some EPs. And we really only have one album that is amazing.
Right.
So I guess it's one of those things where, in my mind, I still think of Alice in Chains as a classic band. But on the flip side, it's like, yeah, but out of 6 albums, I only thought one of them was truly great. So does that make them not as classic of a band as I think? Or is there a reason why we still think of them as a classic band?
I think it takes a lot to write an album that can blow the audience out of the water. Just everything, start to finish, you have to listen to the whole thing. It's a lot easier to write a song here and there that everybody goes back to and remembers. But it's also very easy to fall into here's the single, here's the ballad, and here's the rest of the songs from that album that you don't really care about. Alice in Chains might be the only example of a band that puts out releases and just keeps adding to this stack of music that, as a whole, we all look back on fondly. We still listen to it. But when you look at the albums individually, you start to notice more of the holes.
Yeah. I think that's fair. And again, outside of Dirt, if we were to take Dirt out of the equation and just look at the other, I guess, 5 albums, you would have an amazing greatest hits from all those. You would basically just take 2 tracks, 3 tracks from each one of them. And a lot of bands are like that. Most bands are like that, where they only have 1 or 2 good songs and the other ones are just okay. And that's fine. It's just that I think the reason why we are still talking about Alice in Chains today is because they made one of the greatest 90s grunge albums of all time. And it still holds up today.
Do you think they're one of the greatest bands of all time?
Boy, that's a tough one. They're one of the greatest Seattle bands of all time. But,
that's fair. That's fair.
They've, but not, no. I mean, Dirt would not be in my top 10. Back in the 90s, it would have been. Today, I just love so much other stuff that it wouldn't, it'd be hard for it to beat out all my Dream Theater and Opeth and, all the other Iron Maiden albums. But again, it's a classic from the 90s and it still gets played and I still love it.
Final thoughts on Alice in Chains. Dan?
Well, I don't know if I could top that. I mean, I think that they are one of the greatest bands from their time period. I'll say that because I don't have the Seattle connection. So I think they're definitely one of the best bands of the 90s. And I don't know how well that's transitioned into modern day. But if that's all that you're looking for, I don't think you can really go wrong with Alice in Chains. They're definitely a band that if you haven't heard before, I mean, number one, congratulations. You've now escaped from the cave that you were trapped in. But if you haven't heard Alice in Chains or given them a chance and you like 90s music, you like stuff like Soundgarden, even stuff like Nirvana, even though I hate to make that comparison because the two bands sound really nothing alike. But if you're looking for the same sort of vibe that those sort of bands gave off, Alice in Chains should definitely be your bag, and I think you'll still enjoy the newer albums, even if they don't really hit as well as the classic stuff does.
I think Alice in Chains is the best band that houses some of the greatest songwriters of all time. Unfortunately, the albums as a whole do not stand up to the greatness that is Dirt. But if you are a fan of hard rock, heavy metal, grunge, classic rock, it's all there. And then you have this ambiance of these two minds that come together and create this. I still can't tell you what it is. I really think it's a level of emotion and expression and consciousness that I'm just not allowed to comprehend because I can't tell you what makes Jerry Cantrell and Lane Staley's combination so great. So for all the reasons that I just said, if you're not listening to Alice in Chains, you should be. Jason, Metal Jesus, final thoughts on Alice in Chains.
Well, it's everything that we've said. I guess the only other thing that I would say is that Dirt and Lane's output in Alice in Chains is just some of the most raw and brutal examples of drug addiction that has been put down into music in a way that is both heartbreaking but also real. And that was what was shocking about it at the time, is that he was just completely open about it. You knew exactly what he was thinking about, and we were watching it in real time. And I think that those lyrics and those songs that they wrote still resonate with people today. We're still dealing with heroin addiction, drug abuse, and depression, and all the things that he talked about. And so that's why Dirt and some of those albums still resonate with people today.
And what's your album of the week?
Album of the week. Oh, crap. And it can't be what we're listening to.
It can be whatever you want it to be.
It can be. I just try to sound like a cool guy every week and not pick what we talk about.
Well, that's funny. I completely forgot about that you guys do this. So, the album I've been listening to so much is Dream Theater's Distance Over Time. It's their most current album. It's a return to what makes Dream Theater great. It's heavy. It's progressive. It's over the top. It's everything I want from Dream Theater. So I've been listening to a lot of that. Also, another one, I know you only said one, but the new Whitesnake album is really interesting. I'm an old school Whitesnake guy, but they have David Coverdale's built pretty much an entirely new band around him. So it has Reb Beach in it, who is one of my favorite guest stars in Dokken back in the day, but he's played with a bunch of people. So I've been listening to some of that. It's not a perfect album, but I am enjoying it.
Did you have the same reaction I did when Mike Portnoy left Dream Theater? You were initially shocked, and then you said, well, obviously they're going to call Mike Mangini.
You know what? I didn't know who that was at the time. I wasn't.
Really?
But now that he's in the band, and I'm like, wow, that was a perfect transition. I really, really love Mike Portnoy. I follow him on social media. He was such a big part of Dream Theater back in the day and a reason for their success. I love the fact that he would create custom playlists for every single show. So for a while, Dream Theater would never play the same show twice. And that was all because of Mike Portnoy and just his love of music, all the covers that he did. So I'm a big Mike Portnoy fan. However, that said, they've survived him and they continue to thrive. And so I love him. So
I was always a fan of his different way of looking at drumming. Yeah. He had a reputation for being this definitive progressive metal drummer. And when you got right down to it, he was just a hard rock guy that knew how to count to numbers other than 4.
Yeah. It's funny because I have one of his drumming DVDs where, he breaks down, I think, a Liquid Tension Experiment. And,
yes.
I know, and I'm never going to be able to play that, but I love watching it. Like, it's just fascinating to watch him break some of those fills down. It's like, yeah, it's incredible.
My comprehension of polyrhythms starts and stops at Pantera.
Oh, okay.
I can play in 7 if you want to play in 4, but, once we get to the end of it, we're eventually going to line up.
Yeah, and so Mike Portnoy, and also, too, he's such a huge fan of music. That's why I love all his side projects where he did the Beatles thing, he did the Who thing. He went on, he was doing the 70s progressive rock thing with Transatlantic, playing with just anyone and everyone. He's such a music fan, far beyond what he's known for, which is the metal and the progressive rock. So, yeah, love. If he was to come back to Dream Theater, obviously, I would love it. But the stuff he's been doing outside of that is great too.
For me, this week when I wasn't listening to Alice in Chains, it was Opeth, Deliverance, and Damnation.
The perfect 2 albums. I love those albums.
Dan brought over their behind-the-scenes studio recording DVD because, that was a thing back in the early to mid-2000s. Every band put out the making of, and it was brilliant because we love that stuff. And I'm watching this lead singer who's clearly a different type of guitar player who can sing and growl and do whatever he wants, write these long, drawn-out compositions that fundamentally drive me insane because my initial reaction is always, you just threw a bunch of riffs together, then I start to write it down. And I realize, no, his brain's just different than mine. And I didn't know Deliverance and Damnation was kind of different from what they were known for. I didn't realize that this idea of the A-side, B-side being quiet and heavy was not what they did.
A good example of, I forget, his name's Michael or Mikkel, whatever the lead singer's name is. He came through on the Ghost Reveries tour here in Seattle, and so I saw him in this little tiny club, Opeth on the stage, and I'm like 4 people deep. It's like really intimate. But anyways, what was really fascinating about him is that they're heavy and they're growling and all this. And I don't know if you've seen Opeth live before. Have you seen him live?
We actually saw them in Chicago on the Progressive Nation tour with Dream Theater, Between the Buried and Me, and 3. And Opeth was most definitely the highlight of the night for us.
And was he talky? Like, he's a chatterbox when I saw him.
Extremely.
Yeah.
It was just before Watershed came out, so they were playing a lot of the songs from Deliverance and Damnation, and then he would just talk for 5 minutes.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I bring it up, and the reason, you're mentioning about how varied they are, I'll never forget this, because so I'm watching them in this little club. They're heavy as shit. And then he's talking, he's like, hey, he's like, I love Seattle, but can you guess my favorite Seattle band? And this is an audience of people from Seattle, right? So, and this is during Ghost Reveries. We're like, oh yeah, here comes the Nirvana, here comes the Alice in Chains reference, and he's like, and people are shouting out names of Seattle bands. He's like, actually, it's Heart. Heart is my favorite Seattle band. And I remember thinking, what? Like, really? Here's this Swedish death metal band and his favorite Seattle band was Heart. But knowing that and listening to Damnation and Deliverance, you can start hearing some of those 70s harmonies and the acoustic guitars and that stuff.
His comment at our show right before they played something acoustic, I don't remember which song it was, he mentioned that this next song was extremely heavy and brutal and you would like it unless you hate death metal. It's okay though if you do. I didn't like death metal. And it was just straight acoustic, not even any complicated anything going on.
You look at where he's at now. I mean, he just fully embraced the lighter side of things, and it's not even light. Like some of the stuff that they write on their newest albums are actually still kind of heavy. He just doesn't do the Cookie Monster over it anymore. And it took me a little while to get used to those albums because I'm more of a meathead when it comes to metal, and I just like, heavy all the time, but it definitely took a while for those albums to grow on me. But man, I could never deny Opeth in any of their incarnations, even the old stuff that he claims to hate. I'm still like, this is still really good. Like, I don't know what to tell you.
Speaking of meathead, what's your album of the week, Dan?
Oh shit, we're still recording, aren't we? Oh, okay. My bad. My album of the week, I've actually gone back and been listening to Death. So The Sound of Perseverance by Death has been my album, and the version of it that I have actually comes with the DVD, so it's fun to watch the DVD. And I actually watched the DVD of a live show that comes with that CD with my 5-year-old the other night, and she was like, "Oh, he seems very angry," and I was like, "Oh, it's." But I mean, look at his hands. Look at what his hands are doing. Like it's incredible. So yeah, that's my album of the week. I love that thing.
Jason, thanks for hanging out with us, man. Words do not express. That's all I can say.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. Like I mentioned, I'm a huge fan of your podcast, and it's been my honor to be on here. I'm so thrilled. You guys are awesome. I love talking about music, digging into the nitty-gritty of Alice in Chains. That was fun.
There's one record player left in the world. It has enough power to play one record one time. You have a choice: Painkiller or Firepower. Which one do you choose?
Oh, dear Lord. Wow. You know what? I'm going to say Firepower. Because here, I know, and I know I'm opening myself up to hate. However, Painkiller is a great album, but it's pretty doofy in the lyrics. Like those lyrics sometimes are stupid, right?
You're right.
and so I think Firepower is, because of the lyrical content's a little bit stronger, and we're talking like very small degrees, because a lot of Judas Priest lyrics are pretty dumb. But I'm going to go with that. That's my answer.
I got what I need.
Incredible. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I agree definitely on the lyrics thing. I would have figured you would have picked Painkiller just for the classic status alone.
I know, and I was tempted. That's the safe choice. So I'm going a little edgy, because honestly, both of those albums, they are amazing. Like it's Painkiller's. Firepower is just a return to that sound and that energy, and God, they just destroyed it. It's awesome. All right, guys, have a good one.
You too.
Bye. Bye.
So if you've been listening to this podcast as long as Jason's been listening to this podcast, then you might know that we are trying to cover as many bands as we possibly can, but we haven't covered everybody yet. So if there's a band that you want us to cover, reach out to us. There's so many different places you can reach out to us. You can reach out to us on Facebook, under facebook.com/discography discussion. We have an official Facebook group. You can ask to join the group, and I will approve you. We also have a Discord server. There's a link in our show notes. If you click on that link, you'll get invited to our Discord, where you can chat with us in real time and give us band suggestions. You can also reach out to us on Twitter @discussmetal, or you can reach out to me personally @discussmetaldan, or to Joe personally @discussmetaljoe. You can also send us an old-fashioned email at danandjoeshow@gmail.com. There are so many ways you can get a hold of us. If you haven't gotten a hold of us yet, it's your fault.
And on that note, this has been episode 123 of Discography Discussion. Thank you for listening. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter @discussmetal. Subscribe to our podcast everywhere you listen to podcasts, including Google Play, iTunes, and Stitcher. Visit discussmetal.com for all things discography discussion, and please send questions and comments to danandjoeshow@gmail.com. If you are not a patron, you can become one at patreon.com/discussmetal. We have some sweet perks.
Give us your money.
Metal Jesus Rocks can be found on YouTube and Twitter. Links will be in the description below.
Hey, Joe, watch out for the Yeti.